It seems that all remained of his training in the mind of each recipient was the faulty syllogism, officers should be gentlemen, I am an officer, therefore I am a gentleman. After this, he seemed to behave neither as an officer nor as a gentleman in generally any accepted sense of these terms. And Raven says this, once an officer is established in his own view as a member of a superior and order-giving class, he never loses this sense. This is where things turn into a nightmare, right? So an officer is established in his own view as a member of a superior and order-giving class. He never loses this sense, but he can and often does lose all awareness of the moral basis of this superiority and all the qualities which constitute this basis. So he forgets why he's in this position. He forgets that he was just like placed here. He starts to believe his own bullshit and the bullshit that's been fed to him, that people run around calling him sir and saluting him. He just becomes superior, as it were. In vacuo, which means in a vacuum. He's in a vacuum, he's just superior. He becomes a gentleman. When this happens, one gets that product so typical of the British, the amateur English officer, highly trained professionally and morally, he has forgotten his professional techniques and sloughed off on his sense of moral obligation, but he retained an unassailable sense of his own superiority and absolute right to give orders. And my note next to that was nightmare. That's a nightmare. To forget how you ended up in this position, to forget that you don't know everything, to just get told that you're an officer and you're superior, and you start to believe that. This is a nightmare for leadership. Nowadays, things are different. The social distance between officers and men, more often than not, contrived rather than rooted in their ancestry. For officers of humble origins, this might well be expected to produce sizable problems of adjustment. The first jolt to their social reinforcement standard will be of one of descriptive discrepancy. What's interesting about this is there's no guarantee. Like, I knew officers that came silver spoon all day long, and they were just down to earth, good people. And I also knew silver spoon officers that thought that they thought that they were superior. I also knew some guys from lower class that scrambled through and scraped through and became officers, and they were awesome, and they never forgot where they came from. And I also knew officers that had come up through the ranks, and they were turds. Leif points out that the best officer that went through his junior officer training was a prior enlisted officer, and the worst officer that went through his junior officer training was a prior enlisted officer, which is crazy to think.
Yeah,
that's crazy to think.
I think that I agree with that. Your description, those four categories, whatever you want to call them, same thing, seeing the exact same thing. And I'm trying to remember the way you were describing it. Is I remember, I guess I don't remember like the first time it happened, but there's like a ceremony. Do you have a first salute ceremony?
Yep.
And I remember that being an incredibly uncomfortable experience for me. Like, man, this is weird. The guy who I did it was a good friend of mine. He was an enlisted Marine. He had fought in Desert Storm. He was a known, well-known guy. And just by virtue of accomplishing the criteria to make me an officer, like from one moment to the next, he saluted me.
Yeah.
And I think I was just lucky to have that sense of like, man, this is weird. You know, but also I think you described it well, like the reverence for the institution. Like, this is how the institution is designed. And if you have that reverence for it, he didn't feel demeaned and I didn't feel superior. And yet,
that's the way it's supposed to be.
And yet how easily, like, oh, I could get used to this. God. You know, how quickly people fall into that trap
they fall into that trap all
and
day
it's
long.
It's not the institution that bestowed this on me.
Yeah.
I deserve this.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, and this, again, we're talking about the military specifically, but you can apply this anywhere. You can apply this anywhere. Oh, well, I went to this college. I went through this program. I got my MBA from here or there. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, did I tell you that? Did I mention where I went to college? You know, it's like, Yeah, that's cool, man. Appreciate it. That's awesome.
Yeah, but when you say it, nobody notices that you're doing it.